What about creation?
Now let's stick with the house of Israel.
All right. Good morning, Eastside Seventh-day Adventist Fellowship members and non-members. It is March 25, 2023, and we're doing Sabbath school. And the book we're going through is Prophets and Kings. This is an old one. Sam has put a link to some newer language versions that are out there. So it might be worth looking into, since this is the second to last chapter that we're going through, called The House of Israel, chapter 59. I like to throw in some visuals for people. So this is the second to the last chapter in this book, and this book is one of two books that wraps up the Old Testament. And the next book is Desire of Ages, which I'm actually real excited about. Desire of Ages is really kind of something that took traction for me early in college. And I think in a lot of ways gave me a deeper understanding of Christ and his mission. And I will be honest, I did actually read through the whole Conflict of the Ages at least once in college. And I enjoyed it. I did not grow up appreciating Ellen White much, because there were a lot of do's and don'ts, it seemed. And it seemed like a lot of this came from a couple individuals at our church that spent a lot more time in the red books, I think is what they call it, as opposed to the actual Jesus and his ministry, which I think the Conflict of the Ages deals with a lot, especially Desire of Ages. Obviously my personal opinion, and nothing against those people. The people we have here with us today is my wife, Jody. I'm John. My dad is another John, calling in from Boring, Oregon, and right next door is my sister's house with my brother-in-law, Lee Meadowcroft. So if you've followed this Sabbath School series, you've seen us before. It's kind of my go-to group for panelists. I will say, especially with Eastside, if there are members that are interested in being panelists, it's not a closed group at all. So, reach out, let us know, and we can try to get you involved. So a lot of this is to kind of give people time to get on board. And anyway, chapter 59. I usually give a little bit of context and a little bit of overview. And I'll tell you that this chapter falls into the category of summary. And it's a long chapter. I forget how many pages. But it's not like you sit down at 9 o'clock and you're done at 9:30, at least the pace I read. Yeah, it's page 703 to 721. So 18 pages. And it doesn't involve a specific story so much as a summary of the failings of Israel. And then obviously some reflections on how that could be the failings of the church of today, which I want to touch on at the end at least. But then also they touch on a parable of Jesus having to do with the vineyard, which I think is interesting because that is when Jesus was actually here on earth, and he was talking to the Pharisees, which I think this chapter, as much as anything, talks about a transition for Israel, where Israel came out of Babylon. They started by building the temple, the city, the walls, and then the city. and they had a couple times when they were falling out, and then a couple leaders that we followed. Most recently, I think was Nehemiah and Ezra. Got them back on track, but Ellen White does mention that they no longer go back to the idolatry, at least in the form that they had for hundreds of years prior, that ultimately, honestly, resulted in the captivity of Babylon. But then it's clear that when Jesus comes along, they still have some of the same tendencies of not reaching out to others, is probably the shortest way of saying it. Anyway, and it always kind of brings to light whether the Adventist church has those tendencies, and if so, what, and then if so, how do we not do that? So I'd like to touch on that at least at the end. But we usually start out by giving my wife a chance to tell us what she thought was most interesting to her. And I'll just say she likes to be first, because then she feels like there might not be anything left when everyone else teases stuff out.
Yeah, and I'm worried about what somebody else is going to say.
So what stuck out in your mind is especially remarkable, and it's to you. It doesn't have to be based on my summary or even what
No,
the
I
chapter
feel like
is about.
she kept on kind of going out and coming back to the same point about their failings, I guess, and what they had done. And then I read After You in this book, which John tends to mark up a lot. So when I was reading, I was like, man, he is drawing a lot of parallels between us now and their condition then. It was a lengthy chapter, no doubt. But yeah, I felt like she kept coming back to the same. She'll go out, make a point, but then keep coming back to like the ways Israel had not done things the way that perhaps that the route that they could have gone.
Right. So you said out and back twice, tease that out a bit. And then I like what you said at the end, the way Israel could have gone. So woulda, coulda, shoulda. But first, what do you mean by out and back?
Well, just by giving different examples of what they had done and then coming back to don't keep bugging me. Don't bug me for specifics because we'll get there.
It doesn't have to be that specific, just in general. What do you mean by out and back?
Well,
Did not go to Australia.
No, she talks about different periods of their time and coming back to their failures. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go with your teasing out right now.
Well, I think what you're trying to say is that, there was this pattern of failing that basically started in a lot of ways after they left Egypt. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. And then they wanted a king, and then they had kings. And it's truly remarkable. There would be a king that did what God wanted him to. And then it seemed like two or three that just got worse and worse before another king would finally come along and do what God wanted him to. And clearly the people would follow the king. And a lot of it had to do with idolatry, which was, not following God and taking up the practices of the surrounding nations. And I think that kept happening. And that's ultimately at least partly what led to the captivity in Babylon. The other part was that I think God had a mission for Israel, and that was to reach out to these surrounding nations and be a positive influence on them. But they seem to have a tendency of taking the negative from around them and incorporating it into their life, which would separate them from God. And it took strong action on God's part to get them turned around and come back. So is that what you mean by out and back?
Well, sure. I guess what I meant was like, she would give this example, then come back and talk about their failures, then give them an example, talk about their failures.
And what, like I said, it wasn't a specific story. So then you said something at the end about what Israel could have done. What would you mean by that? Just,
I think she was just saying like, they could have done better and it could have been, the outcomes could have been different.
all right. Comments? Or moving on. Lee looks like he's ready to say something.
Did you want me to comment or did you want me to say what my first impression?
All of the above.
Make a comment and then tell us what you thought
I
most interesting.
I like what you were saying about how you were trying to define what Jody was saying, but they not only did they go, you know, did they bring the negative things from the people around them, but then what they did, the follow-up is then they would like keep to themselves, and that's another thing that I think is the you know, the negative flip coin to that is not, they were no longer trying to seek out, they were just hunkering down and building a wall around themselves, which Ellen White's saying, yeah, that was wrong too. So that's my comment as to what you were saying. That, I mean, the things that, unfortunately, the things that struck me were either very sad or sort of negative. On this is my version, which is I think just a different cover. It's the same version as yours. Page 710. What really, when I read this, it made me really sad for Israel and actually for us too, to a certain degree. For 1,000 years in songs and prophecy, in temple rite and household prayer, his name had been enshrined, and yet when he came, they did not recognize him as the Messiah for whom they had long waited. He came unto his own, and they received him not. I mean, that struck me as so sad that I like how she put that together. It's like, yeah, they've been seeking the Messiah for 1,000 years and then missed the boat.
Mhm.
And that, I mean, you can't get any sadder than that. And then bringing it to today's world, she on page 717 near the end, she's kind of wrapping up all these thoughts, and she's attributing Satan to some of this behavior from Israel that we've gone over throughout the chapter. But then what really struck me is that somewhere in the middle of that page, she says, not only is Satan leading the world captive, but his deceptions are leavening the professed churches of our Lord Jesus Christ. And that to me was kind of like, wow. I kind of see that going on now. People who are professing to be followers of Christ are driving what I see as such a negative perception of what Christianity is. They're sort of becoming what we saw with the Pharisees, like, oh, well, if you don't believe this exactly way, you're wrong, and we're going to punish you and we're going to take all these rights away. It was just kind of not scary, but just really, again, sad that I see this happening. And I don't know, those are the two really negative Debbie Downer things that that really jumped out at me when I read this chapter.
Well, yeah, and even the sentence before is what I had marked, where Satan's work is plainly revealed by rapidly increasing darkness, the multitudinous errors, heresies, and delusions. And I mean, how much of that do we see? I mean, today and now. I mean, it's there is this increasing, attack on the truth, I guess is the best way of saying it, where how do you know what's true? How do you know what's false? And then how do you know that what it really is? And that goes along with these multitudinous errors. I mean, that's a word no one ever uses, multitudinous, but just the false stuff that we are presented with on a daily basis, is hard and it's overwhelming. Heresies, gets kind of towards truth, religiously the truth. And I agree with that sentence you said, it's a leavening of the churches. The churches are, I mean, we live in a Christian nation, but look at the Christian churches and how different they are. And, what some churches stand for versus what other churches stand for, and the controversy that exists just within the, supposed Christian church. It is somewhat disturbing for sure. So, Dad, let's have you either comment or tell us what you thought was most interesting.
It was very much along the same line as you guys are talking about. I picked it up here, page 704. Israel has just gone back to, the Israelites have just started again rebuilding Jerusalem. And it says here, the Lord exhorted those. In other words, the Lord told them, the ones that were engaged in rebuilding. And then what he said was, and show mercy and compassion every man to his brother, and oppress not the widows. In other words, take care of widows, nor the fatherless. That's orphans. The stranger, that would be an alien, nor the poor. Let none of you imagine evil against your brother. And I thought, well, now, just a second, that sounds kind of familiar. But then if you go on to page, let me see.
So that was page 704 in the middle.
Yeah, in this one. Then on 709, I picked up something that I thought was interesting, and it just basically says what they did is they decided to go back to the law. But did they take the law? Oh no, they just took the law and then they made more laws of their own, tons of more laws. And so it says here on 709, with all these minute and burdensome exactions, it was practically impossible for people to keep the law. In other words, they made the law so that it was impossible to keep. That's when Christ came. And you can see that because what did they kill him for? Because he was breaking the law, at least their version of the law. And then on page 714, it's kind of interesting to me. She starts off by saying today. Now, bear in mind, that's something like 1917, okay? So that wasn't yesterday, that's 100 years ago. But in any event, she says, today the Church of God is free to carry forward to completion the divine plan for the salvation of a lost race. So she's talking about freedom there. And then it goes on, for many centuries, God's people suffered restrictions. And she goes on to say that there was a time, and I'm gathering this was before 1917, that there was a time when anybody was following the Lord. What they were doing was killing each other and carrying on in all kinds of, this is not quoting from her. But anyway, she says here that the people were deprived of the light of God's word. The darkness of error and superstition threatened to blot out a knowledge of true religion, to say nothing of science. God's church on earth was verily in captivity during this long period of relentless persecution, as were the children of Israel. Anyway, it sounds like it was pretty bad, but then she says, but things are better now.
Oh, I'm not sure she said things are better now. Well, maybe she did. I don't want to speak against my father.
I agree with you, John. I'm not just junior, not senior. I do think I
agree with everything you said until you said things are better now. Because I think what she's saying is Israel had a reset with the Babylonian captivity. God gave them the opportunity to leave Babylon and to start anew. And that since then and since Christ, and I interpreted this middle paragraph on page 714 that you started out with today, is that we have had since Christ's times, the dark ages. And I think that comes up in either the last book or second to the last book, where there was stuff going on that nearly put Christianity down. It appeared at the time, at least, that Satan was having more successes than God was with the Christian church, based on the political powers of the time. And so when she said today, I agree, it was 100 years ago, but we do have a freedom now, especially in this country, where we are able to do basically anything we want within, the moral laws that we have, and that we have an opportunity based on that freedom to start doing what Israel didn't do. But then the question I have is, are we doing better or not? And I want to talk about that at the end. That's my response to what you said, Dad, at least just to put that last statement in context, and things are better now. I don't know. I'd like to think they are, but I still don't know. Lee, you were talking.
Well, no, I'm trying to put it in the context of when her time is, when you have this huge revival, and yeah, Christians are no longer persecuted as they were like in early Roman times, or throughout history, Christians have killed other Christians for all kinds of reasons. But she's coming from an American point of view, where the church is kind of in power, right? You've got a quote unquote Christian nation, and we're going to, our laws, flow from that. And so I think I worry more about that, to be honest. I worry about us trying to create heaven on earth, which is what I see kind of happening. Is, oh, well, we believe this, therefore we're going to legislate everything that we believe. And if you don't believe that, and we've seen that through history, and it never ends well, and we're trying to do it again.
And Lee is an attorney, so he'll have that perspective a little bit more than my dad and myself.
Well, to Sam's point, Sam brought it up in the chat. Is it hard? Yeah, I think it's much harder for us to follow the laws and the directions that we create for ourselves, because we try to define things as we see it, right? So, you could say care for everybody. That's a great rule. That's a great something to follow. And then you can say, well, what does that mean? Well, we have to provide food for people. Well, how much food? Well, we have to provide this kind. Well, okay, let's not provide pork, because that's not going to be good for their health. So, you break things down into the minutia, and you get into the weeds. And this is what happened to Israel. And I think Ellen White points that out. It's like they tried to do something good, and in doing so, they created such a negative, bad thing. And that's, to my point, where I saw it was so sad that they somehow had this great plan and then just screwed it up. And we do that all the time.
So just so that everyone knows, in case you don't have access to the chat, Sam is always lurking in the background, at least when the Griffin or extended Griffin family is doing Sabbath school. It may not be for the others, but he threw in the comment box, is following God's law and direction easier or harder than the laws and directions we create for ourselves? And so that's what Lee was responding to, which is interesting. And because I'm a fairly active, when I want to concentrate and tease stuff out, I actually am fairly active in my reading, in that I'll actually write in the book. And that's what I kind of have a problem with these electronic books, because it's just not as easy to do. But on page 709, there's this pattern. I tried to tease it out, and it was very difficult, because it's not a mathematic formula. But in some ways, Israel was instructed to be different from those they were around. And these are my comments. that I just wrote at the bottom of the page. So they were somewhat separated from others, but at the same time, they're called from God to reach out to others and bring them unto themselves. But their failings were that they tended to take on what the others were doing. So there's kind of that dichotomy. And then the next thing was that God had given them commands, with the 10 Commandments and then, the old law stuff. But then they kept adding their own stuff to it. And that bothers me. And it bothers me a lot because I think as Adventists, we might do that more than we realize. And I don't know if it's just human nature or what, but this creates a burden. And she mentions, and that was what my dad was talking about. It was not only more burdensome for those that were following the law, the priests and the Levites, which eventually became, and eventually there were Pharisees and Sadducees and all that, that made it difficult for themselves trying to, be as good or better than what God wanted them to be. But it trickled down to your regular, Joe, the plumber guy, was in this situation where he couldn't keep the laws, as it were. And so then what's the point in trying to keep the laws? I mean, you almost turn your back and walk away from it to some degree. So that's another dichotomy that we create for ourselves. And then there was this, so the fourth thing was that obviously, and Lee mentioned this, a lot of what was going on was getting things set up for Christ to come as, the Messiah. And I'm kind of using two words, if, the Greek and the Hebrew, so I apologize for that. But the Israelite failing was that they weren't prepared. They were prepared for something totally different. So when Christ came as he did, they couldn't wrap their minds around it and accept him. And they ended up killing him. And again, a lot of it had to do with, the laws and stuff that they did create. And so in surgery, we have this thing, and this is a response to Sam's statement. In surgery, we have this thing that's called, there's all kinds of things. It's called the enemy of good is better. And the idea is that when you're in there doing something, you're obviously always trying for perfection to some degree, and it can be difficult because what we're working on are very imperfect human beings that are sick, and that's why they're getting surgery, so they're less perfect than they are even at baseline. But the idea is that you're going in to do something, and you want to do the best that you can. And so a lot of times you get away from the good that you've done and you try to make it better and you mess it all up. And so that's where the enemy of good is perfect. Is that what I said? Or better. The enemy of good is better. Do we do that with God as we know God and with the commands that he sends to us? In the Old Testament with with the 10 Commandments, and then with Jesus himself? That's my first question.
John, can I speak here while people are thinking about how to answer that just a little bit as well? That is that it looks like to me, and in defense of that things were bad during the Middle Ages, Galileo was not killed, and he was thankful for that, but it was on the verge of getting killed because he believed that Earth was not the center of the universe. I mean, people now have unusual beliefs, but hardly anybody's killed on the basis of a different idea of scientifically. But that was the way it was then. We have Sir Isaac Newton, who had a whole lot of religious ideas. He never mentioned them. Why? Because he wanted to live, and they would have killed him if they'd have found out what he was talking about. And so it was bad then. That's not to say, though, that everything's perfect now. It's not. And to respond to Sam, see, I believe that the idea of the 10 Commandments is not something to judge by, but it is a guide so that you can live more successfully and more happy and enjoy life much better. All you need to do is get sexually involved with your neighbor's wife, and life can be really hard. I know somebody that killed somebody. Life became very complicated for them. They went to jail, all kinds of things. And when you go down through those lists of 10 Commandments, those are really just things to help us live successfully. If we follow them, we'll just plain do better. And it seems like to me that sometimes what has happened is we have preached the gospel successfully, but it needs to be changed. I remember when I was young, my understanding of what Christianity was about, and I'm talking about general Christianity, that being evangelicalism or Protestantism, is that every day in every way we're getting better and better. That was it. And the belief at that time was that the universe was exactly the same way now as it had been for billions of years. And it was not changing. Well, these things have all changed. At that time, Adventism was preaching that the end of the world is coming, that things are going to get bad. Well, today we don't have to say that. We have everybody and his son believes that things are bad, getting worse, and it looks like, according to the Don't Look Up movie, that things are going to end bad soon. So that seems like to me then the question I have is, at this time, what is the gospel that we should be telling people? What is the good news? And I'm wondering whether it was basically the message of hope and mercy. Mercy means that somebody did something wrong and we gave them mercy. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out as kind of a direction to think about as well.
So that's actually my frustration with this chapter. It has a lot to do with my type A personality. And I went back this morning and I didn't reread the whole chapter, but you mentioned that she said today, she said that on page 714. She also said it on page 716. And so I went back and reread that because I wanted the specifics. It's like you need to do A, B, C. If you're going to be a better Christian than the Jews were at the time, they came out of Babylon, and at the time Jesus was here on earth. And it was frustrating because there is, in my opinion, no ABC. She bounces around with a bunch of things that we've heard. And Dad, you mentioned it earlier on, and I had it. It was basically page 704 when you quote this Zechariah thing: execute true judgment, show mercy and compassion, and oppress not, and let none of your imagined evil against brothers happen. And it was like, wow. I mean, that almost sounded like Isaiah as Jesus quoted it, but it's actually Zechariah. And then you mentioned, the gospel, and you said change, and I don't think you meant that the gospel changed. I think how we present the gospel maybe needs to change. And in life for me got a lot easier when I realized that the 10 Commandments weren't, check boxes 1 to 10 that I had to follow, but they were examples of what you did if you loved God the way you're supposed to love God. And that's why there's in my mind, a lot of gaps in between. And you can take that and you can extend it to how we live now, as opposed to 100 years ago when Ellen White lived, as opposed to 2,000 years ago when Jesus was here on earth, as opposed to, however long ago it was that this book and the last book covered. And love, it's a big word. and a lot of people can take it a lot of different directions. But I mean, kind of in the way Christ meant, love God, love your neighbor, and, treat others the way you want to be treated, and follow the commandments. We'll all follow, and, all the rules. And in that quote that I gave earlier from Zechariah, it's like, yeah, I get what Ellen White's doing. There is no ABC. We've heard this, and we've heard it over and over again, but we just don't seem to do it. And now I'm not saying just individually, this group of people. In a lot of ways, I'm referring to the church, because, I see a lot of stuff that happened with Israel. This book's called The House of Israel. What's going on in the house of Seventh-day Adventists? Are we preaching the gospel of love? Or are we telling people, the most common response I get when I tell people I'm an Adventist is, oh, you guys don't drink and smoke. And then if they know anything more about Adventists, they assume that we don't eat meat. And it's like, really? I mean, that's the house of Israel that the Adventists have fit themselves in. Tell me I'm wrong.
John, I think we're doing a lot better. I think the Adventism that I grew up in, I mean, I'm the exact same age as you are, so it might be the same story, but that's exactly what I was actually even taught. That's what makes us special. That's what puts us in a different category. Is like, we don't drink, we don't eat, pork, don't. It was always don't. And I think that was what I was, at least where I grew up, that was kind of the whole attitude. We're special because of these things. I think we're doing a lot as a church. I think we're doing a lot, but I'm not saying that has gone away, but I do think that we're doing a lot better at focusing more on, loving Christ. I mean, back to that point John was talking about, I love what you said about surgery, because it's the same thing in laws. When I was regulating foster care, which is very similar to, residential care and all that, we would, you care for somebody. That's the overarching goal, is you provide good, loving care to a resident. And over time, that one rule that used to be a couple of pages is now 90 pages of, well, that means you have to do this. And then somebody will find some way to kind of go around a rule. And so we write another one. And so your sister has this, I mean, she runs a residential care facility, as you know, and the kind of things that she's required to do now, I look at it and say, that's kind of nonsensical. It's taking so much of her time that you think 50 years ago, we couldn't provide care. We could provide excellent, loving, wonderful care to that same resident that we do now under a whole new, scheme of rules that somebody is doing, not just to be mean, not just to be, onerous, but they actually think this will make things better. And I think we do that religiously and spiritually. If I put enough restrictions on something, that will make it better. And I honestly, as I'm getting older, and maybe I'm getting more, more heresy in my life, but I'm rejecting that. I'm trying to get more gray rather than black and white, because I see the black and white does so much harm. And I can be wrong. So if I'm so adamant that I am right on this one point, whether it be on anything, I think I'm doing a disservice. I don't think I'm bringing people to Christ when I'm just pointing out how wrong they are.
Well, Lee, just to underline that a little again, that is that we are in John 3:16. It talks about the plan, about what God had in mind. But in 17, he said that he did not come to condemn.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that Christians in general, and does not exclude Adventists, there is a tendency for us to tell other people what they do wrong a lot. I can remember one of the naughty problems I had when I was in practice was that I had a couple of Adventist women that came in that swore that my receptionist did not wear a bra. Now, I thought, I can't believe that we're discussing this for a couple of reasons. One, the Bible doesn't even mention a bra. The second thing is that there's no way in the world that I can discuss with her, what she wears. And the other thing was that she was wearing a bra, she told me. So, it just shows you how that the spirit of condemnation or criticism, we don't like to think of it as criticism. We like to think of it as being commentary or whatever, our perspective. But nonetheless, it tends to come out as condemnation many times. But we aren't really asked to condemn anybody that I can see anywhere in the Bible.
Yeah, but we're pretty good at it. I think that's where we excel, a lot of people. Because we've got the good news, or we know what's right. And so we, instead of saying things out of love, we tend to go with the condemnation, I think.
Yeah, that's where we come back to mercy and love and compassion. Those are pretty hard. That kind of a thing fits in pretty much any environment.
Yeah, so Sam had a comment here. I think this is his comment. I think that when we put more restrictions on people, we soothe our desire for controlling and keeping everyone predictable. There is a power in that which is honestly quite attractive. And so my comment is, yeah, and quite controlling. And I think that's interesting because the God we serve, my belief is it's a God that gives us freedom and free will. And so often we take that and we try to control others, which is, just the opposite of what God does. And I think, yeah.
I mean, one of the major thrusts of Christianity at the present time has to do with making laws against abortion, or making laws about homosexuality, or laws regarding transsexuals. And it doesn't mention anywhere in the Bible that we should do these things. And it seems like to me that these are just examples of ways that society is trying to control people. And it's leading to a lot of death and disaster.
And I think control people instead of love people is the key. And unfortunately, a lot of churches are backing that up. And so it bothers me. And so the question for me is, what do we do about it? Why do we take the good news of the gospel and try to make it the better news of what I think you should be doing, instead of the actual gospel that Jesus gives us and shows us?
Could it be that we should stop preaching and just do more doing? I've got to be careful because I don't want Sam to blot my picture off of here. But anyway, I do feel like that that one of the criticisms that I saw earlier in this chapter, it said that Israel was not a blessing to the surrounding nations. That was one of the condemnations they made. And the question in my mind that I've been puzzling over is, the Hoodview Seventh-day Adventist Church a blessing to this community? Or is it just nothing? Or is it in fact a liability? And I think that what we are being asked to do at the end of time is to be a blessing to the people around. We don't have to preach. If we're a blessing to the people around, they'll be attracted to us. They'll say, why? And that'll be an opportunity for us to share what we have.
Yeah, John, I think to follow up on that, I think when we hear the phrase, be like Christ, we often think of, oh, well, he was loving and he did. But after reading this chapter, one thing that really dawned on me is, like, that could also be, Christ doesn't hit you over the head and say, you have to follow me, you have to do this, right? And I think as a church or as individuals, we need to be more like Christ in the sense that what you're saying, love, just do. We don't have to tell people, well, you're doing this wrong, because Christ didn't do that for you. He's letting us come to him. He's saying, please come. Here's the example. And I think it gave me a new way of thinking about that phrase, that we need to just, if we can show everybody the love of Christ, just how we are, we don't have to preach them to death. We have to love them to death. And they may reject it. And that we have to be maybe sad, but okay with that. We can't force anything because Christ isn't forcing us. He's asking us.
I think Lee is getting very close to, in my opinion, what Ellen White wanted us to get out of this chapter. Because like I said, I went back and reread it. And on page 715, I'm not going to read it, but she basically says that we need to heed God's instruction to withdraw from what she calls spiritual Babylon. This is the end of that first paragraph. And then the interesting thing is, so that we can stand as trophies of divine grace in an earth made new, which again, I don't aspire to be a trophy of divine grace. But then it's interesting what she says. The next comment is, after in the earth made new is the heavenly Canaan. And that just blew me away. It was like, boom. So one thing is to withdraw. And then I kind of followed it along in the next page. So it goes from 715 to 716, is that we need to be warning those that are on the brink of ruin. And how many people do we know that have just made bad decisions, can't figure things out, and have gotten farther and farther from God and are heading towards ruin? So withdraw was one thing, warn was the other. But in order to be effective at warning, we need to have that relationship. It needs to be a loving relationship. I don't think you can take that legalistic approach and just hit them over the head with it. And I agree with Lee. Jesus was and a lot of stuff that they talk about is preaching, and Jesus was kind of the ultimate preacher. He preached in parables, but it was also the lifestyle. He never took anyone head on with condemnation. I mean, the closest he got was with the Pharisees to some degree, but it was with their actions. But you look at his actions, and he never forced anyone to follow him, forced anyone to do anything that he said. He put it out there, and he had the relationship and the lifestyle that people desired. And I think a lot of that lifestyle was a truer understanding of what we were talking about, the rules and regulations. A lot of it is superseded by love, and love will carry you through this stuff that we've created for ourselves. There's stuff that's almost impossible to follow. And so warning, I think, is one of the important things. And then on page 719, it's working. And she does, I'm going to read this one paragraph. It's the second paragraph. And it says, there are many from whom hope has departed. Bring back the sunshine to them. And she's spending a lot of time talking about light and darkness, which isn't unique to her. We get a lot of that with Martin Luther King Jr. and stuff like that. But she says, these are the things that I teased out that seem like the things she wants us to do. It's like, bring back the sunshine to them. Many have lost their courage. Speak to them words of cheer. Pray for them. There are those who need the bread of life. Read to them from the word of God. And upon many is a soul sickness, which no earthly balm can reach, and nor physician heal. Pray for these souls. And then this is the statement, bring them to Jesus. Tell them that there is a balm in Gilead and a physician there as in Jesus, but bring them to Jesus. And I think the Spirit of God will take them from there. But I think that really struck me as things that you can do, bring light to people by being cheerful and lifting them up and giving them hope, encouraging them with words of cheer. You know, so if they've lost their courage, you can help them, pray for them, you know, read to them or share with them what you have read, I guess would be another way of saying that. And bring them to Jesus. And a lot of it will be the lifestyle you live and them seeing a difference between you and the lifestyle that other people live.
And John, it's interesting to me that on page 720, she has a paragraph there that's actually a quote from, it looks like it's Isaiah. I beheld, and lo, a great multitude. In other words, a whole bunch of people. I looked, and lo and behold, a whole bunch of people, which was more than people could number. I mean, we're talking thousands, if not millions of people of all nations and all different groups of kindred and people and different languages, and they were standing before the Lamb of God. These were the saved. And it's interesting to me, it doesn't say a particular church.
Right.
It's talking about all nations. That means that here in Boring, 2,000 years ago, there were people living that will be, you know, in heaven, you know. And that means that we've got to really reach out in some way with kindness and love and mercy to a lot of people from all different areas.
Yeah, that's the bottom of page 720, and it's from Revelation. And I think that's the word, and probably the key word that Israel didn't wrap their minds around, and that we need to be careful with Adventists, as Adventists, to wrap our minds around it. We need to reach out. We can't try to do better than what God's already done amongst ourselves with the rules and regulations and then close ourselves off to others. I think we need to keep it open with love and mercy, like you said, and reach out to those who are around us. I mean, it's so much easier to reach out to people you know that are in church and school that you go to. It's a lot harder when it's people at work, you know, even if it is people that you know, or you know, if it's people outside your immediate work environment or just your neighbors or your community. I think those are the people that you need to reach out to, and you can't reach out very well if you don't know them. And so I think you need to take that step and say, hi, how are you doing? And they aren't going to say anything up front the first time, but after you get to know these people, they're going to start telling you how they really are doing, which often isn't, you know, what you actually can perceive by just looking at them.
That's looping back. Lee mentioned that the very first thing, the very first comment about us staying to ourselves.
Right.
And
I don't think what Christ wants us to do is to stay to ourselves. I agree with what Dad's saying. I think we need to reach out to others. And that kind of goes along, Sam threw another Ellen White comment from another book. I don't know which one, but she says less sermonizing and a more simple, direct, personal work is needed. Sermons appropriate to the occasion will do good, but personal and individual labor is essential if souls are won to Christ.
Does it have a reference there, John?
No, I'm sure we can get it from Sam.
Sam, I'd love for you to text that to me, because that I think is the gospel, man. That's exactly what I'm thinking about.
So, yeah, and the irony is that in this day and age, so that's from Gospel Workers, page 189. The social media and all the technology we have, the one thing that is proved more and more to me is that, you know, this idea that one person can do a lot is a fallacy. Well, no, is not. Let me just restate that.
I was like,
The idea that one person cannot do much is a fallacy. You know, it may not be that you make a comment on social media and you're going to get millions of followers and go viral with it, but it's crazy to me how sometimes people do. And I don't think Christ wants us to go viral that way, but making a couple connections, every once in a while, and then just building on that every couple weeks, every couple months can do amazing things. And what you don't know is what those other people did with what you sent them and built up around you. And, Christ doesn't want me going viral, but he may have someone that I've had contact with and been able to have share some of the good news with that does go viral or doesn't go viral and just, continues to spread that good news to others. I don't know if I said that as well as I wanted to, but the idea is that little comments, little segments, the kind of stuff you see with social media, my kids are like TikTok kind of stuff. These short segments can do a lot more than you realize. And, they're looking at close friends and interacting with them, but they're also looking at the bigger picture. And then you never know when, the little picture becomes the big picture. And it's kind of this ebb and flow of information. And if that's positive information, good news kind of information, that can do a lot. Without you.
It's staying connected, John. I mean, back to my example of how I was taught in the 70s versus now, like ecumenical ministries was literally an evil thing. And now I'm glad that we don't think of it as that being completely evil, because we are interacting with other believers of Christ. And yes, they have different ideas. And but how are we going to change anybody if we just hunker down? I see this in so many aspects. I don't want to get political or whatever, but things like homeschooling. I see people that say, oh, well, this one child at that school is non-Adventist and whatever, so we're going to take our kids out. We're going to put a wall around them. And I know I don't want to open up a can of worms. Parenting there's a lot of aspects, but that's the mentality that I still see a lot of is, hey, this one thing is not good. So we're going to, let's circle the wagons and prevent anything that could be bad. And I don't think that doesn't do anybody any good. You can no longer witness because now you're just in your little, circle. And yeah, I don't know. I'm getting off in the weeds, I know, but I
Stepping on toes, leave for somebody.
well, I step on toes. I think that's my spiritual gift. If I have one, that's it right there.
But I think what you're saying is right. You can't just close down and put up walls around yourself to protect yourself. It just doesn't work that way. And God will provide the protection you need if you reach out and start spreading that good news. And I think the other take home for me is that, stick with the good news, stick with Jesus and what he did in the Gospels. Realize that there is an overlying principle, and Ellen White talks about these principles at one point in this chapter, that covers a lot of territory. And those are, love and mercy, obviously, but then individually reaching out to people, meeting them where they are, and helping them how you can. And sometimes that's just words of encouragement, obviously praying for them, sharing with them what from the scriptures, from the Gospels, from what Jesus gives us. And that's the good news. And then the mistake we make is taking that good news and trying to make it better news, taking that individual approach and trying to go viral with it is bound to fail. Stick with what you know and what you can do. And then, like my dad said, we need to just do that stuff, keep on doing what you do, and God will work through you, and I think can make a big difference. And ultimately, what this chapter comes down to, and I think we get into a little bit deeper with the next chapter, which is titled Visions of Future Glory, is that we are preparing for the coming of Christ, to take us from this world of sin and to bring us to a new earth. And we don't want to miss that like the Jews did when Jesus came to earth. They were as prepared as they should have been. And still their expectations were something totally different, to the point where they weren't willing to accept Christ the way he was. And we got to be willing to be ready for when Christ comes in the future, and hopefully the near future. And everything seems to be kind of leading towards that. I think we should wrap up. I think we'll say a quick prayer, and then we'll wrap up. So, dear Heavenly Father, thank you for a chance to discuss this chapter. Again, not a specific chapter with a specific story, but a summary in a lot of ways of the successes and failures Israel had, with you working with them and with them, sometimes working with you, but sometimes working against you, for fears of what might happen with those around them. Please help us to not have those same fears, but be willing to reach out and share the good news that you brought with your son, Jesus, when he was here on earth. Ultimately, to love and to show mercy, and more importantly, to live the life that he lived, so that others can see that it is a better life, a life of light. And please help us to have a good Sabbath this Sabbath, and bless us and continue to be with us in our words and our deeds. In your name, amen.
Amen. Amen.
So this will be recorded and available later. I know Sam left a recommendation for Conflict of the Ages books. It's a link to a site that has newer language books that we're going to be coming into Desire of Ages after next week. I think myself, it would be nice to see what one of these books had to do as far as an update on the Conflict of the Ages series. Church is at 11:15. It will be online, but certainly it's a beautiful day. We're planning on
There's a
attending.
baptism at 3:00.
And there's a baptism at 3:00 in Kirkland, at Kirkland St. Damas Church as well. So we invite you to continue to follow this Conflict of the Ages series, and also continue to follow with the church service. All right. Thank you, everyone.